Hello, Sec2s. So today I am going to explain to you a little bit about source-based questions. And this is going to help prepare you for the upcoming common test next week. So if you remember for the whole term, last term, we actually spent a lot of time looking at possible question types, right? So we begin the term with PIL. So that's for essay questions. And then we progress onto this SBQ very quickly, where we looked at source-based questions. Okay, so this is the background information, right? You can pause the video for a while to read it. Okay, in essence, it gives you the context in which all these sources are relevant. So in 1874, this was when the policy of intervention took place, right? Prior to this, okay, Southeast Asia was seen as a place for trade, right? It wasn't really seen as a place where there will be active involvement for mining, right? And even if there was some form of involvement, it would be without having to politically supersede the locals, right? All right, so that's the context. Okay, so we did this source, right? And I made you make two inference. So the first inference would be that the journalist views the Pankot Treaty as beneficial. So we saw the evidence, right? That thanks to this, right, there'll be pacification of the country, development of resources, and advancement of trade and general security and life and property. If this is from the source, since it's copied from the source, you have to explain it with your own conceptual understanding. Okay, so what are all these things? Pacification of the country. Okay, so this implies that prior to this event, the country was in some state of unrest, or maybe pacification could be its relations with the British, right? So perhaps the relationships aren't so good, so you need to pacify them. You know what it means to pacify a baby? Baby's crying, so you pacify, right? So you return the baby to a state of peace and rest. So that's pacification. Okay, so restoration of peace, in other words. Right, so you can actually write that down. This suggests that peace was restored. So that would already be a form of explanation. Okay, but then of course, this evidence is so rich, we can explain other things as well. Development of resources. So what does it mean by developing resources? It means that prior to this event, the resources are not developed or they're underdeveloped, right? Okay, so maybe an example would be all the mines were in a way not ideally set up. And so in its state of you know, development, basically inadequate development, the resources which were tin could not be mined and processed in a very efficient way, right? Maybe one of the outcomes would be a lot of the tin is wasted, or a lot of the tin cannot be mined properly. So you develop the resources, right? You develop the infrastructure to facilitate extracting these resources in a more efficient and effective way. If you said all those things, that's also considered explanation. And of course, the last section would be the advancement of trade and the general security of life and property. Right, so when you have already extracted the resources, then you need to trade it, right? Because it's not possible that you can use all the tin on your own, unless if you know, Malaya couldn't use the tin on its own, so it had to trade it right back to England, or Britain. You can call them Britain. At this point, you can refer to England as Britain. Okay, because the common name was the British Empire. Okay, so it was traded back to the British Empire, where industrial actors could convert this tin into useful products such as cans. You can can food and then preserve it for times when you really need it, like winter. It's great because it prevents food wastage and it reduces the price of food, and during especially difficult times, difficult seasons. And of course, the last part, security of life and property. How do you explain that, right? In order for any society to function, in order for capitalism to function, in order for humans to have dignity, they need to know that their life and their property is protected by a state, okay, which we understand, okay, as the sole legitimate user of violence, right? So this is a definition given by a philosopher. You don't have to know who this is, so I'm not going to explain it further. But in the discussion of like property rights, right? Okay, during the Age of Enlightenment, people realized that it's so important that no matter who you are, regardless of your religion, regardless of your race, what is yours is yours. You worked hard for it, it's yours, right? Your family owns it through the generation, it belongs to you, and the state is there to enforce this. Okay, but if the state is ineffective, then it won't enforce it, and then this will cause the whole society to crumble. Okay, so I can say that that's why economic benefits, right? Economic outcomes are so tied to social outcomes as well. Because if people are not given the freedom to become as rich as they can, based on their brilliant ideas, based on their talents and abilities, then their social outcomes will very much be limited, right? Imagine I come up with a wonderful invention, someone steals it from me, right? I don't have economic protection, then I also won't be able to enjoy the social outcomes like better housing, better transport that comes from my economic gains. So the state exists in a very strong way to defend both the economic and social outcomes of private individuals, right? So by and large, from this source, from this piece of evidence, you can infer that the Pankor Treaty was beneficial as it protected the economic and social outcomes of the people of Malaya, or people conducting activities in Malaya. By and large, it created a society that was governed by law and order. It created a society that was safe. It created a society that was conducive towards innovations. So all those ideas that I have like elucidated over this really short time, if you can have any conceptual understanding of it and bring it into your explanation, this means your explanation is complete, right? And it doesn't have to be very long. Actually, the minimum line requirement is just one statement, one sentence, and that would be adequate. So then we went on to the second inference, which is that the journalist views the Pankor Treaty as essential. Okay, so we realized that both inferences cannot overlap, right? Even though they may be able to coexist, right? But they cannot be exactly the same. So that's why let me explain to you now why beneficial and essential is not the same, right? There are many things that are beneficial in your life. Like for instance, I would say, oh, it's very beneficial to live in a condo. It's very beneficial to you know, go for exercise every day. But they may not necessarily be essential. They may not be essential. Like for instance, if you can run every day, that's good. That will really boost your metabolism, it will boost your stamina, so on and so forth. But if you can only run twice a week, if you can run 3 times a week, that's sufficient. Okay, so many things in life are beneficial, but some things are absolutely essential. Like for instance, eating, right? If you don't eat even for one day, you're gonna be very hungry. And if you don't eat for like 4 days, 5 days, I think you can potentially die. Maybe not eating, but drinking is even faster, right? I don't think people can avoid drinking water for very long before they suffer from heat stroke or they suffer from dehydration and die. Okay, so drinking water is essential as compared to running. Running, even if you don't run for one whole year, I've known people who don't ever run. Ever since they reach adulthood and they've passed their NAPFA test, that's it, right? They never run ever again. So beneficial and essential, not the same. Therefore, you can give both inferences and get the full marks. Having said that, the caveat, right, the opposite is that if both inferences are exactly the same, or like someone says, oh, I can see that the Pankor Treaty was viewed as beneficial. I can see that the Pankor Treaty was viewed as advantageous. Okay, so advantageous and beneficial are the same thing, right? So even if you choose a different evidence and you explain it, you don't get the additional marks. So likewise, what I do is that I pick an evidence. So it says, Perhaps the most serious weakness of Sir Harry Ott's government was his indifference towards the disturbances that were chronic in the Malay states. Sir Andrew Clark, on his arrival as governor, he at once saw that was his first duty to put an end to these disturbances. Okay, so what does it mean? Okay, I have to make sense of it, right? So that's the explanation bit. I bring in my conceptual understanding. Okay, so disturbances that were chronic. Okay, so these are two concepts that need to be explained. What's disturbances? Okay, so disturbances implies that the state of peace, right? The state of order, the state of law has been disrupted. Chronic means that it's ongoing. Okay, like diseases, they said, oh, I have a chronic disease. And then they said, oh, like what? Oh, I've got heart conditions. Maybe I can say that, right? So my heart suffers from palpitations and I'm very, very prone to things like heart attack. So chronic means over a long period of time. Okay, and if I say that disturbances were chronic, what it means is that it was a chaotic situation and there was no peace. And honestly speaking, who wants to go to a country like that? Like right now we have the situation in Israel and Palestine, right? It's also chaotic. It's also chronic in its disturbances. So of course, this could have been something that Harry Ott was happy to overlook, because as we have discussed in class, he was close to retirement. So he didn't see a need to quickly solve this problem. He thought it was someone else's problem, and also he was following Her Majesty's directive, which is that they will not intervene, right, at any cost, unless if it's something to do with piracy. Okay, so this was if the disturbances were caused by people the locals, right, the succession disputes and also the tin miners themselves, this is not caused by piracy, then Harry Ott is not required. Next, you have Andrew Clark. Okay, where his first duty was like, going to put end to this disturbances. Okay, so I need to explain why this leads back to my inference about necessity, about essentiality. So I can say this suggests that the treaty was the enabler of British intervention, which was required for the restoration of peace in a previously chaotic situation. Okay, so I actually included some words that showed conceptual understanding. Okay, the words were enabler, right? So without this treaty, okay, the British will not be enabled to then restore peace. Okay, it's like a key that opens the door. So that's how I explain it. All right, so I know you may think that this is a very long-winded explanation of I, S, and E. Okay, inference, supporting evidence, and explanation. Okay, but I'm giving this long-winded explanation to you now, primarily because it's a video, right? It's not class time. So anybody who has any doubts whatsoever, you can clear the doubt out by listening to this video in your free time. You can even rewatch it over and over again to go through the thought processes that I go through, right? Typically when I'm teaching lower sec, my advice to you is that you know, when you're writing your inference, it doesn't have to be long. The inference is just short. It's a point, right? It's just, oh, I infer. You can just give an adjective. And then after that, spend more time, okay, selecting a rich enough evidence that has certain words inside, or like in the first example, so many words, right, that can be explained, and then explain it using your own words, your own conceptual understanding. Repeat the process to get full marks. Okay, this time around, inference will no longer be tested because you guys already learned it last year and did very well in exams, so we know that you can do this. What you'll be tested, however, is on similarities and differences. Okay, so once again, let me emphasize that how similar and how different requires you to give one similarity and one difference. You can't just give two similarities, or you can just give one paragraph. Okay, so you can pause the video now to read the source or the second source, okay? So in essence, the first source is the Pankor Treaty. So the Pankor Treaty was signed between the British and the locals, right? So we're talking about the Malay rulers, whereas the second document is signed between the British and the Chinese. Both were signed on the same day. Okay, so you can look at the background information. Before this treaty, Britain had followed a policy of non-intervention. A separate agreement was signed between the British and the Chinese secret societies on the same day. Okay, so two treaties were signed. One was to placate the Muslims, and the other was to manage the chaos caused by the Chinese. Divide and conquer. Okay, so let's compare. The similarity is that both were pointing towards a chaotic situation before the British intervention. So source A says property are not adequately protected. Piracy, murder, and arson are common. Okay, so this suggests that Perak was not a safe place to conduct business. Okay, that's conceptual understanding. And then source B says, both sides in the disputes shall be disarmed and their stockages destroyed. So this suggests that armed violence was actually common in Perak. This is something I went through with 2i2 today, and I explained what stockages are. Stockages are places where you can store the weapons or your basically armory, right? So can you imagine these people don't only have like weapons, they have stocks of bullets and other sort of weapons. And they're not even part of the proper military. Okay, so we are talking actually about the miners here. Okay, the miners, the gangsters themselves, they actually have a lot of weapons. That's a problem, isn't it? Okay, so all this point towards the presence of chaos in Perak, not unlike the situation in Israel and Palestine. The difference is that the extent of local involvement in the ruling of Perak afterwards. So remember that Perak is the perfect case study for what of indirect rule, right? So the local rulers still have some degree of power, okay, at least on paper, and the British would be ruling through them. And I think we have explored like the reasons for this, and I actually also like went through with some classes that it's not necessarily better when you are under indirect rule. Although there are some perks, of course, because if you're under indirect rule, it means that certain of your rulers, if they are extremely convincing, they might be able, through their interaction with the British, to steer some of their decision making so that local customs and religions are protected. Okay, it's still better to have a voice than to have no voice at all. But the negative effects of having like indirect rule is that people may not be able to see that their power has gradually been diluted, because the optics wise, right, visually they can see that their local rulers are still there, and not only that, but their local rulers are actually getting richer. So people who are not well educated enough and they don't understand the nuance behind what's happening might very easily fall for the lie that the local rulers are still in power, when the truth is that they have lost all their power to the colonial masters. And this makes maybe organizing anti-colonial efforts much harder. Okay, so indirect rule, right? Okay, so now we back to this question. Sources A and B are different in terms of the extent of local involvement. Source A tells us that Malay rulers will still continue to rule, whereas source B tells us that the British will be the new rulers. Okay, so the evidence of this is source A says, Her Majesty's government is bound by this treaty to protect the kingdom and to assist the rulers. Okay, so the fact that the word is assist and not replace the rulers suggests that the British would still allow the rulers to retain power. On the other hand, source B says, shall be subject to the regulations of the British resident, omitting any mention of the local rulers, suggesting that the British were taking over completely. Okay, so that's the difference. Okay, for similarity and difference, please take note that your criteria cannot be lifted from the source. So it has to be in your own words. Okay, it's basically looking at it in terms of the overarching theme, right? What is the overarching theme that is similar? What's the overarching theme that is different? But all these things have to be inferred, which means it's not directly lifted from the source, it's inferred from the source, backed up by evidence and explained using conceptual understanding. Okay, at this point, okay, you can pause and then if you feel like you need more practice, you can always approach the Sec 2 History chat board. Okay, last but not least, we're going to look at the skill of purpose. Okay, so study source C, why was this article published? All right, so pause this video and read. Okay, so now you have read it. Let's move on. Okay, so last term, I went through VAMI method with you guys. If you're from iSpark classes, we've already done this since last year. So this is just a revision. Okay, so the method is to establish VAMI, right? And then VAMI has to be established in that order. Okay, so the journalist published this article because he wanted to, sorry, I'm going to change this to he. So the first thing is to note is that convince, okay? You can use convince, persuade, criticize, defend, whatever it is, it has to be a biased verb. Right? It means that the focus is not on telling, informing, right? Because telling and informing means that you don't have any bias purpose associated with it, right? You're just trying to educate. But when you are trying to convince someone, when you're trying to persuade and influence someone, it implies that you're putting in additional effort to maybe cause an obtuse understanding on the topic area for the desired outcome to occur. This happens all the time, especially when you look at things like advertisements, right? When you watch an advertisement for a film, for instance, they only tell you the good things about the film. They don't tell you the honest truth, right? And some people do say that like everything that is good is already in the trailer, right? To convince you to watch it. And so there's obviously an attempt to conceal certain things. There's also an attempt to exaggerate other things, and all that is embedded within the verb. That's why VAMI starts with a V, right? You need to use the verb. So once you are able to use the verb, convince, persuade, influence, criticize, praise, then it conveys to the examiner that you are able to understand that this source is biased and it's unreliable, and therefore it's a higher level in terms of the marks that you get. Okay, having said that, I will categorically warn you against using the word tell and inform whenever such a question is asked. Okay, whenever there's a why question, you must never use the words tell and inform. Got it? Okay, next, we need to establish the audience. Okay, so Straits Times. Okay, Straits Times, let's go back, is obviously published in the Straits Settlements, right? So these people who can actually read, okay, English, the bulk of them were obviously British, right? They were British. So they are the British or they're Western educated, but it's very clear using the pronouns, based on the pronouns, we British, we British, okay? So he's speaking to the British people, so you can write that other British citizens. Okay, so this is the audience. So we got V and A. Okay, so now what's the message? Message is actually your main inference, right? The main message. Okay, so he was saying that the Pankor Treaty was an appropriate and strategic decision. All right, what does this imply? Okay, it implies to you that he's actually defending it, isn't it? That probably he's defending it because it was actually being criticized. Okay, so this can be seen in, it was simply that our own peaceful trade had been disrupted by the more barefaced murders and destruction, and was left to Sir Entry Clark to secure some legal control and a full protection of trade. Okay, so you can see from the use of the adjectives here to describe the various aspects that he's very positively biased towards everything the British were doing. And he was quite negative towards what the locals were doing, right? Because he called his own trade peaceful, and he called the conflict, okay, barefaced murders and destruction, right? Trying to, in a way, elicit that kind of emotive side of things, that trying to say that I know all of you guys are suffering now, right? You probably are suffering more than you did before the Pankor Treaty because of this increase, the surge of violence that's happened ever since the Pankor Treaty was implemented. Okay, case in point, those of you who don't know, after the Pankor Treaty was implemented, the very first resident was murdered, right, assassinated, and then that led to some unrest, trying to basically arrest and then also execute those people responsible for the assassination, right? So obviously, people were starting to question whether the Pankor Treaty was a good idea, whether intervention was at all the solution to the chaos, or was it contributing to even more chaos. Okay, so that's why there's a need for such articles that would be published and read by the vast majority of the British people, okay, who had followed the East India Company, or at this point basically the British, right, crown directive, and migrated into Malaya for the purpose of business or for the purpose of government. All these people are wondering, what are our leaders doing? Okay, and these articles are always there to breed and to grow the sense of security, the sense of confidence towards their leadership. Straits Times always has been doing that. It's still doing that till today, right? Breeding and in a way cultivating and securing a sense of confidence for the government. Okay, so back to the answers. This suggests that British intervention had provided much needed civility and safety against the local backwardness and violence. Okay, so that explains this, right? So it's basically to reassure the people that what the British did in terms of implementing the Pankor Treaty was the right decision, right? And that they should continue to support this, despite all the teething problems and the temporary inconveniences. So I then highlighted this part because it's not necessary, but if you can provide it, it's called context. Sometimes you provide the C, which is context, before you provide I, which is the intended outcome. So sometimes VAMI can be VAMCI. So it can be VAMC. But this is not necessary in Sec 2. It's a more upper Sec skill set. But if you can introduce it here, you'll be rewarded for the exam as well. Okay, you will be rewarded for it at the exam as well. So how do you introduce context? You can use the words during that time. Okay, during that time, the Pankor Treaty had been signed for nearly 3 years, and the first resident had been murdered. Okay, so provide some context. So then you say, thus, explain it back to why this article is published. Okay, it was likely that British intervention had become a contested issue amongst the British, particularly those who were residing in the Malayan region. Why? Because when all these outbreaks and unrest happens, when the military comes in, it definitely disrupts their life, right? It disrupts their business too. Okay, so now we go on to the I, intended outcome. Thus, the journalist wanted to influence the other British to continue to support the intervention, right? And the expansion of British control over British Malaya instead of questioning and doubting it. All right, so please bear this in mind, right? When you are looking at a source, mass media source like Straits Times, and the basically the way it was written is very clear that it was referring, we British, right? Referring to, using the pronouns we, other British people. That will help you ascertain the audience, and also the fact that the provenance states the Straits Times will also help you ascertain basically what its purpose is in terms of intended outcome, which is to cultivate, grow, and nurture a sense of confidence, likely towards the ruling order. Okay, so at this point, I would like to say that I have received some messages from you guys via GChat. Some of you have been very proactive, which I'm very, very grateful for, in seeking help from your seniors. Okay, however, the syllabus has somewhat shifted. Okay, and the scope of the test that you are having is going to be different from theirs, right? I'm the one who set the paper and I'm the Sec 2 coordinator, so I should know it. And I'm telling you that everything that is in your Google Classroom given out this year is already adequate. So please do not be overly zealous and try to acquire advice from your seniors because they might be telling you the wrong thing, right? Instead, go and look through everything that we've gone through from the start of the year, okay, from the pure paragraphs, to the coming of the Europeans, okay, to Introduction to Southeast Asia, right? That's the very first content chapter, as well as the case study of Perak. All the slides are already located in your Google Classroom. And if you feel like you are very short in terms of time because of your NSG or other competitions and commitments, I would say the very baseline thing you need to do is to read your textbook, page 1 to 39. Okay, and also relook at all the class exercises that we did, including the pure paragraphs, including the March holiday homework, and also the SBQ that I just went through in this YouTube channel. Okay, having done all of that, if you still have questions, also go to the Sec 2 chatbot that I programmed. Okay, and if all else fails, and you still have a question, okay, feel free to contact me via Google Chat. Okay, I think that the message I want to tell you guys is essentially don't be too nervous. This is your common test, and it is actually pitched at a Sec 2 level, right? So it is not very different from the last year's end of year exams, except that for the rest of the consortiums, ProEd, Affiliate, and Authors, you guys are doing purpose for the first time, right? For iSpark, there's no difference because you guys have already learned comparison and purpose since last year. So the format is exactly the same, right? And so if I were you, I wouldn't panic. I would just ask myself, okay, you know, what is the best way I can go about memorizing, or in a way, condensing and processing all the content? Like, and maybe for you, the best way is to draw a mind map, right? And if that's the case, then draw the mind map out. Okay, and for others, they prefer to just sit down and highlight their textbooks, right? Then they put lots of stickers and post-its, and then they just keep reading it over and over again. Okay, in any case, whichever way you process that information, you need to have a way of retaining it so that at the exam, no matter what question is being asked, you have some content and examples to back it up, right? To back up your reason, okay? To back up your answer in the pure paragraph section. As for the comparison and the purpose, right? That one is something that has a lot to do with logical reasoning, right? Can you see the logic that was explained in this video? If you could see the logic, right? How everything is structured in terms of inference, supporting evidence, explanation, in terms of verb, audience, message, context, and intended outcome, right? Then the only thing that you can do in order to increase your chance of success is through repetition, right? You keep practicing, right? Maybe you look at the sources in the textbook, right? And then you ask yourself, well, can I infer a message from this? Can I infer a purpose from this? And in fact, if you wanted to, you can even put the selected source that you found from the textbook into the chat board, and then say that, hi, I would like to infer a purpose from this source, right? Can you teach me how? And the chatbot can actually go through it with you step by step, ultimately showing you a model answer after you have attempted it once. Okay, so getting into that frame of mind of being able to look at all these things very intuitively, without panicking, really comes from having sufficient preparation, both on level of content and skills. And I feel that that has been my focus in terms of teaching you guys since the very start of the year. Every lesson has been either inquiry based, where I gave you time to process the information, okay, or I gave you, or it has been in terms of practicing a question, right, on the spot, where I gave your brain a chance to practice logical reasoning. So not a lesson has passed where you never had to think, where we have already thought through this very well together for more than 10 weeks now, right? Yeah, more than 10 weeks now. So trust yourself, trust your brain, trust the process, and these marks do not define you, right? These marks are just a milestone for you to cross, and to see if you are ready for a more large scale exam, like maybe the national exams, right? But it doesn't indicate your potential, it doesn't indicate your intelligence. So I hope you all can take it in that kind of spirit where it's so good to do well at it, because it's a reassurance to yourself, right, that you've been following the lessons well and you have a good sense of logical reasoning. But if even if you don't do well, nobody's gonna judge you. I'm not gonna judge you. Well, we just have to continue like refining your skills together. But if you did well, then of course that's something that's a cause for celebration lah, and I hope you all can do well. In the end, like, we have the rest of the year together. There are still so many months left to learn. So don't be too impatient, and I wish you all the best for the upcoming exam.